Hey people, it's nice talking. Now I wanted to take a break and do different things, so this is political philosophy, and so this is the source, Sanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, so let's get started. Hobbes' moral and political philosophy. The 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes is now widely regarded as one of a handful of truly great political philosophers whose masterwork, Leviathan, rivals in significance the political writings of Plato, Aristotle, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, and Rawls. Hobbes is famous for his early and elaborate development of what has come to be known as social contract theory, the method of justifying political principles or arrangements by appeal to the agreement that would be made among suitably situated, rational, free, and equal persons. He is infamous for having used the social contract method to arrive at the astonishing conclusion that we ought to submit to the authority of an absolute, undivided, and unlimited sovereign power. While his methodological innovation had a profound constructive impact on subsequent work in political philosophy, his substantive conclusions have served mostly as a foil for the development of more palatable philosophical positions. Hobbes' moral philosophy has been less influential than his political philosophy, in part because that theory is too ambiguous to have garnered any general consensus as to its content. Most scholars have taken Hobbes to have affirmed some sort of personal relativism or subjectivism. But views that Hobbes espoused divine command theory, virtue ethics, rule, egoism, or a form of projectivism also find support in Hobbes' text and among other scholars. Because Hobbes held that the true doctrine of the laws of nature is a true moral philosophy, the differences in interpretation of Hobbes' moral philosophy can be traced to different understandings of the status and operation of Hobbes' laws of nature, which laws will be discussed below. The formerly dominant view that Hobbes espoused psychological egoism as the foundation of his moral theory is currently widely rejected, and there has been to date no fully systemic study of Hobbes' moral psychology. Alright, major political writings. Hobbes wrote several versions of his political philosophy, including the elements of law, natural and politic, also under the titles Human Nature and De Corpore Politico, published in 1650, De Cive, 1642, published in English as Philosophical Rudiments Concerning Governments and Society in 1651, the English Leviathan, published in 1651, and its Latin revision in 1668. Others of his work are also important in understanding his political philosophy, especially his history of the English Civil War. Behemoth, 1679, De Corpore, 1655, De Homini, 1658, Dialogue between a Philosopher and a Student of the Common Laws of England, and the questions concerning liberty, necessity, and chance. All of Hobbes' major writings are collected in the English works of Thomas Hobbes, edited by Sir William Molesworth, 11 volumes, London, 1849 to 45, and Thomas Hobbes' Opera Philosophica Q Latina Scripsit Omnia, also edited by. I'll just skip this. You can read that in the description. Number 2, the philosophical project. Hobbes sought to discover rational principles for the construction of a civil polity that would not be subject to destruction from within. Having lived through the period of political disintegration culminating in the English Civil War, he came to the view that the burdens of even the most oppressive government are scarce sensible in respect of the miseries and horrible calamities that accompany a civil war. Because virtually any government would be better than a civil war, and according to Hobbes' analysis, all but absolute governments are systematically prone to dissolution into civil war. People ought to submit themselves to an absolute political authority. Continued stability will require that they also refrain from the sorts of actions that might undermine such a regime. For example, subjects should not dispute the sovereign power, and under no circumstances should they rebel. In general, Hobbes aimed to demonstrate the reciprocal relationship between political obedience and peace. And if you understand, this is the complete opposite of Thomas Jefferson, the founding fathers, where he claimed that governments are instituted by the will of the people, and it's their will, if they become destructive of the ends of the people, to abolish them. Hobbes is completely opposite, that no, they should not rebel. The state of nature. This is a key theme in Hobbes' theory. To establish these conclusions, Hobbes invites us to consider what would life be like in a state of nature, that is, a condition without government. Perhaps we would imagine that people might fare best in such a state, where each decides for herself or himself how to act, and is judge, jury, and executioner in her own case, whatever disputes arise. And at any rate, the state is the appropriate baseline against which to justify the justifiability of political arrangements. Hobbes terms this situation a condition of mere nature, a state of perfectly private judgment in which there is no agency with recognized authority to arbitrate disputes and effective power to enforce its decisions. Hobbes' nearest descendant, near descendant John Locke insisted in his second treatise of government that the state of nature was indeed to be referred to the subjection of arbitrary power of absolute sovereign. But Hobbes famously argued that such a dissolute condition of masterless men while subject to laws and a coercive power to tie their hands from rapine and revenge would make impossible all the basic security upon which comfortable, sociable, civilized life depends. There would be no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. If this is the state of nature, people have strong reasons to avoid it, which can be done only by submitting to mutually recognized public authority. For so long a man is in the condition of mere nature, which is a condition of war, in brackets, as private appetite is the measure of good and evil. Although many readers have criticized Hobbes' state of nature as unduly pessimistic, he constructs it from a number of individually plausible, empirical, and normative assumptions. It seems that people are sufficiently similar in their mental and physical attributes that no one is invulnerable nor can expect to be able to dominate the others. Hobbes assumes that people generally shun death and that the desire to preserve their own lives is very strong in most people. While people have long local affections, their benevolence is limited and they have a tendency to partiality. Concerned that others should agree with their own high opinions of themselves, people are sensitive to slights. They make evaluative judgments, but often use seemingly impersonal terms like good and bad to stand for their own personal preferences. They are curious about the causes of events and anxious about their futures. According to Hobbes, these characteristics incline people to adopt religious beliefs, although the context of these beliefs will differ depending upon the sort of religious education one has happened to receive. With respect to normative assumptions, Hobbes ascribes each person in a state of nature a liberty right to preserve his or herself, which he terms the right of nature. This is the right to do whatever one sincerely judges needful for one's preservation, yet because it is least possible that virtually anything might be judged necessary for one's preservation. This theoretically limited right of nature becomes in practice as an unlimited right to potentially anything, or as Hobbes puts it, a right to all things. Hobbes further assumes as a principle of practical rationality that people should adopt what they see to be the necessary means to their most important ends. The state of nature is a state of war. Taken together, these plausible, descriptive, and normative assumptions yield a state of nature, potentially fraught with divisive struggle. The right of each to all things invites serious conflict, especially if there is competition for resources. There will surely be over at least scarce goods, such as the most desirable lands, spouses, etc. People will quite naturally fear that others may, citing the right of nature, invade them and may rashly plan to strike first as an anticipatory defense. Moreover, that minority of prideful, vainglorious persons who take pleasure in exercising power over others will naturally elicit preemptive defensive responses from others. Conflict will be further fueled by disagreement in religious views, in moral judgments, and over matters as mundane as what goods one actually needs and what respect one properly merits. Hobbes imagines a state of nature in which each person is free to decide for herself what she needs, what she's owed, what's respectful, right, pious, prudent, and also free to decide all these questions for the behavior of everyone else as well, and to act on his or her judgments as she thinks best, enforcing her views where she thinks she can. In this situation where there's no common authority to resolve these many and serious disputes, we can easily imagine with Hobbes that the state of nature would become a state of war, even worse, a war of all against all. Further questions about the state of nature. In response to the natural question about humanity, whether humanity ever was generally in any such state of nature, Hobbes gives three examples of putative states of nature. First, he notes that all sovereigns are in this state with respect to one another. This claim has made Hobbes a representative example of a realist in international relations. Secondly, he opines that many now civilized people were formerly in that state, and some few people, the savage people in many places of America, Leviathan 8 for instance, were still to this day in the state of nature. Third, and most significantly, Hobbes asserts that the state of nature will be easily recognized by those whose formerly peaceful states have collapsed into civil war. While the state of nature conditions of perfectly private judgment is an abstraction, something resembling too closely for comfort remains a perpetually present possibility to be feared and avoided. Duty of assumption of Hobbes' philosophy license the existence of this imagined state of isolated individuals pursuing their private judgments? Probably not. Since as feminist critiques, among others, have noted, Children are, by Hobbes' theory, assumed to have undertaken an obligation of obedience to their parents in exchange for nurturing, and so the primitive units in a state of nature will include families ordered by internal obligations as well as individuals. The bonds of affection, sexual affinity, and friendship, as well as of clan membership and shared religious belief, may further decrease the accuracy of any purely individualistic model of the state of nature. This concession need not impugn Hobbes' analysis of conflict in the state of nature, since it may turn out that competition, dividends, and glory-seeking are disastrous sources of conflicts among small groups, just as among individuals. Still, commentators seeking to answer the questions how precisely we should understand Hobbes' state of nature are investigating the degree to which Hobbes imagines that to be a condition of interaction among isolated individuals. Another important question is that of what exactly is it about human beings that makes it the case? Supposing Hobbes is right, that our communal life is prone to disaster when we are left to interact according only to our own individual judgment. Perhaps while people do wish to act for their own best long-term interest, they are short-sighted and so indulge their current interests without properly considering the effects of their current behavior on their long-term interests. This would be a type of failure of rationality. Alternatively, it may be that people in the state of nature are fully rational but are trapped in a situation that makes it individually rational for each to act in a way that is suboptimal for all, perhaps finding themselves in the familiar prisoner's dilemma of game theory. Or again, it may be that Hobbes' state of nature would be peaceful, but for the presence of persons, just a few or perhaps all to some degree, whose passions overrule their common judgments, who are prideful, spiteful, partial, envious, jealous, in some other way prone to behave in ways that lead to war. Such an account would understand irrational human passions to be the source of conflict, which, if any of these accounts adequately answer to Hobbes' text, is a matter of continued debate amongst Hobbes scholars. Game theorists have been particularly active in these debates, experimenting with different models for the state of nature and the conflict it engenders. The laws of nature. Hobbes argues that the state of nature is a miserable state of war in which none of our important human ends are reliably realizable. Happily, human nature also provides resources to escape this miserable condition. Hobbes argues that each of us, as a rational being, can see that a war of all against all is inimical to the satisfaction of our interests, and so can argue that peace is good, and therefore also the way or means of peace are good. Humans will recognize as imperatives the injunction to seek peace and to do things necessary to secure it, when they can do so safely. Hobbes can call these practical imperatives laws of nature, some of which is not to treat others in ways we would have them treat us. These precepts, conclusions, or theorems of reason are eternal and immutable, always commanding our assent even when they may not safely be acted upon. They forbid many familiar vices such as iniquity, cruelty, and ingratitude. Although commentators do not agree on whether these laws should be regarded as mere precepts of prudence, or rather as divine commands, or moral imperatives, or some of the sort, all agree that Hobbes understands them to direct people to submit to political authority. They tell us to seek peace with willing others by laying down part of our right to all things, by mutually covenanting to submit to the authority of a sovereign, and further direct us to keep that covenant establishing authority. All right, I'm just going to stop it here because I'm reaching the limit. So I'm going to leave the source in the description, and I'll continue this in the second video. Please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. Peace.